Sanjay, welcome to Stories in AI. How are you today?
I'm really well. Thank you for asking. And thanks for having me here.
And thank you for joining. Thanks for taking time. I know we've been trying to do this for a while now. I'm so grateful that you found time to do it. Why don't we get started with your personal journey, your personal story? I mean, tell the audience your background, how you got into all the great things that you do today.
Pretty much everything I've done is by accident, is probably the first thing I would say. So there's no real strategy behind there. I graduated with an engineering degree in aerospace engineering, and then I went on to business school. And subsequently, I started my first position at Hewlett Packard. I was the first product manager, actually for a hardware box. So sheet metal, Unix, operating system, database, all of the core. It
Wow.
turned out that business became a $6 billion business for the company as the Unix server line, if you will, back in the day. And I did that, enjoyed it, loved it a lot. Left HP, became an entrepreneur in the Valley, built four startup companies. They all got acquired by different public large corporations. And then my fourth company was acquired actually by the company I'm currently at, which is Genpact. And my fourth company was a SaaS play in the early days of SaaS becoming mainstream, and it found a great home within Genpact. And Genpact was at the time a business process outsourcing company. And that marriage led to some bigger things because I think there was an opportunity to sort of, for Genpact was on a track of figuring out what the next thing in its evolution was. And obviously, this capability became the starting point for something much bigger. And so I now am the chief digital officer for Genpact. I run our digital business. It's all of the AI, analytics, automation software, the data fabric, and technology services. And the company overall has progressed from being a business process outsourcing company in the past to really a digital transformation professional services company now. And so that's been my journey professionally so far. And of course, I met a few years ago, and I've looked forward to our interactions.
No, that is amazing. What a very accomplished and wonderful journey. It's a dream for most entrepreneurs. Building four companies, getting acquired, all four of them, and then figuring out in one of the acquisitions is a very rare thing. That marriage, right, where you go into a larger company and you get to go and take what you built and expand that into building something net new, and that's just an amazing. And I watched your journey too, right? And we've met a few years ago, 5 6 years ago actually, and I watched how not just you, but also how you were instrumental in transforming Genpact as an organization to who you are right now. So I'd love to actually explore a lot more on what you're seeing with your experience with clients and stuff around data, AI, cloud, if you will, or the linchpins of digital transformation. So why don't we start with your view on the state of the market, right? Where is AI and automation today? What's working? What's not? What is being worked on by organizations? And what is still untouched?
Yeah. And Ganesh, you know this, but just to make sure I caveat this, look, my perspective right now is from the perspective of my current role. So we serve Fortune 500 companies, large global corporations across the world, and we
Sure.
help them transform their existing operations. So it's not necessarily the world I came from, which is I was a startup CEO. So
Yes.
we don't really sort of serve that segment in my current role. But look, I'll tell you this. I think there is a shift to from value to outcome. And what I mean by that
Mm.
is a lot of technology went in the ground based on here's the value that it brings and here's the value you will get, right? I think those discussions are a little bit of the past. And I think the current conversations most CIOs and CEOs are having is what is the outcome that we got, right? So it's more results oriented, it's more specific outcome oriented. And that's changed the dialogue and discussion around how we think about AI and automation overall. I think that has led to a broad based realization that AI or automation is not the answer searching for a question. And what I mean by that is most companies now approach it and say, well, wait a minute, before I jump to the answer, let me first figure out the question. Am I asking the right question? What is the business problem? And how do we think about the business problem? How do we stay with the business problem first off longer than we would otherwise? Because we're all ready to jump into solutions. So let's interrogate the problem a little bit longer than we would otherwise feel comfortable doing, and then reimagine that process, reimagine that endpoint, and then now bring in technologies. And AI has a really large role to play, and automation likewise, but then it becomes a component of the larger answer as opposed to the answer. Um, I do think what's happened though is in the last few years, and I think the pandemic in part is very responsible for this, is there's just been a complete acceleration. And we've talked about this in so many forums around digital transformation. And the reality is that the top three things on any board's mind right now has to do with growth, it has to do with resiliency, and it has to do with transformation. Those are like the three biggest things any board's focused on. And for good reason, because what's happening is the world around us is changing. We work with so many clients. I'll give you one example. We work with a company that actually makes ice creams, the sort of ice creams that you and I would eat, right? Well, it turns out, and I didn't really realize this till I got involved, most of those ice creams, or a good chunk of those ice creams, are sold at movie theaters. When you go see a movie, you grab a cone or whatever, and that's a large channel for them. And it turned out that when we went into the pandemic, the movie theaters got shuttered. And as that happened, this channel pretty much disappeared overnight. And so you've got a situation where you've got a company that's built around servicing that channel, and overnight you're trying to switch it to, how do you get to the Sanjay and the wife and the two kids, blanket in hand, Saturday night, Netflix at 8 p.m., and you want to be able to hit him right there and there with the right offer. And it isn't just about that. It's not about the integration into Netflix. It's about how do you actually set up the back end in the backplane to deliver in 20 minutes that ice cream to that address, right? So that's the kind of change that's happening around us, and that's driving significant appetite for automation and AI, but it's in the context of solving a business problem and delivering outcome, not necessarily, projecting what value we would get out of it. And I think that's a big change from, say 10 years ago when we were all in this together.
Interesting. I think it's very it's very profound that you're actually calling out. It's not just the value that you bring in, but it's the outcome that you influence. So in other words, it's also nobody really cares about how you get to the answer, as long as you have the right answers for the right questions, and then you're giving them the actual outcome. Then hey, here's the thing: is there a corollary to it, or the translation for if you're a company building a new product or offering an AI? Does that mean that, look, platforms that people can generate value on are a thing of the past? You should just go focus on building value-oriented or outcome-oriented products that is powered by AI? Is that the translation you would say?
I think a little bit of what I'm saying is, and by the way, I mean this because I am a technologist at heart, and my entire career is built on that foundation. But I want to say technology is no longer the long pole in the tent. When you're looking at driving large-scale transformation, whether it's applying AI into meaningful uses in an enterprise, technology is one part of the problem. But you have to think about people, you have to think about processes, you have to think about data, and you have to think about technology. It's almost like there are four assets in a corporation, and then you have to sort of orchestrate change very comprehensively across them. Right? So think about people, adoption, skilling, operating models, lots of changes that need to be happening there as you deploy AI as an example. Think about processes, right? It used to be that we did digitization. We take an end-to-end process, we break it into all the components. We take each component, we say, how do we digitize it? How do we automate it? How do we make it faster? How do we do it quicker? How do we do it cheaper, right? That was automation. That was digitization. At the end of that process, the process remained this. The work that got done was exactly the same. It was faster, it was quicker, it was better. We're not doing that anymore so much, right? What we're doing now is digital transformation. So we take an end-to-end process, and then we actually reimagine the process with now the help of these new capabilities that we have that we didn't have. So by the time you're done with digital transformation, the work that gets done isn't exactly the same. Those chevrons don't really match where you started. You've changed the contours of what you do through the use of new technology. And so it becomes very important. And platforms I'll come back to because that's a very important topic in its own right. But the idea is that when you apply it, you have to apply it in the context of the other assets in a corporation and orchestrate change in a meaningful fashion so you can take advantage of it.
Got it. On platforms, give me the thought on your thought on platforms in general.
Well, I think in general, what's happening is, data, AI, and cloud. I mean, they've become the three big levers going forward.
Yep.
And what's really interesting about that platform is that it's a full cycle, right? So AI needs a ton of data. Data needs actually the cloud. Cloud actually powers the AI compute. So you've got this round circle, and it's just it's a flywheel. It just keeps spinning faster and faster and faster. What we're finding out is data has now actually become, for large corporations anyway, the largest driver of transformational value at the time, right? Like unlocking all of that dark data that's sitting in PDF files and voicemails and emails and the like, and being able to bring that out in a way that it can be classified and then acted upon with true AI and analytics capabilities. We truly believe today it's the number one driver of value. Cloud, the whole story has changed, right? The story in cloud used to be its efficiency. It's, hey, Miss CIO, is job number 7 on your list. It's job number 19 for the company. Is that really what you want to spend time on? Let's outsource it. Let's put it in a data center in the cloud, and then we'd sort of get rid of all of this stuff. Single pane of glass, super efficient infrastructure. That's no longer the story, right? The story now is that we're digitally transforming. We're needing to provide our business capabilities that require a completely different backplane of technology and be able to innovate with this new functionality. And that functionality requires innovation. And most of the innovation now is happening on the back of hyperscalers. And so it's the innovation, it's the modernization, it's the new apps that you need to compete in the new world that is driving the consumption of cloud. And the answer is, it's not that it's efficient or it's cheaper. The answer is that it's more innovative, and you can actually be much more agile with new capabilities riding on the shoulders of others. So I actually think this platform thing is super important. And then, of course, AI, I think the biggest thing that we're seeing in AI, and actually, it's interesting, Ganesh, because I first met 4 or 5 years ago, and maybe my own thinking has evolved, right? It used to be that all of us thought about AI as like a big thing, right? It was, you turn to someone and say, hey, what's the first thought that comes to mind in terms of AI? What are they going to say? Autonomous driving, right? Like these are big AI projects, and all of our mindset was oriented to you bring in a big platform and you do big things and you do an end-to-end application. I'll tell you where I've seen the most success, and we're a large corporation, we do a lot of AI across the work we do. It's the small AI, right? It's how do you extract information from an invoice? It's how do you read something on a form and separate what was on the form before it got filled out and what was filled out on the form, and having the intelligence to separate the two using computer vision as an example. And these are small things that you use in everyday life. We use them pervasively, use them all the time. How do you do chatbots? How do you do voice recognition, right? Like these are small things, right? So I don't know if I want to call it small AI, but what I'm trying to talk about is the fact that there's these microservices of AI. There are these small accelerators, right? And being able to plan them in all of your day-to-day, everyday walk of life is actually driving more value than trying to think about like this one big application that'll suddenly unlock all of the value for the corporation. And so at least my thinking has evolved as well. But behind all of that is the platform you're talking about.
No, it's actually interesting. Very, very, very timely you mentioned that, because there's this debate even today, right? You go to a lot of AI practitioners or thought leaders in the industry, they would say, no, you need the big bang approach. You need to actually reimagine an entire AI first organization, AI first business process to go make it happen. But I tell you, even in my own experience working with several Global 2000 companies, the ones that they actually are successful, because AI is an iterative technology, right? Or a platform that helps you iterate to ask questions. It's a probabilistic in nature, so you're never gonna get 100% correct answer. Otherwise you don't need AI or machine learning. So the whole technique of actually how do you build these different capabilities and I love the way you say it, AI microservices, right? And then all of that, when you actually stack it up, and when you can now start doing higher order output at a business process level or an application level, then it becomes that hyper automation that you can drive and create that self-driving business process and so forth. And you're exactly right. I mean, I know there's a lot of, I personally know some businesses that really benefited by taking the big bang approach. But that benefit was not about getting AI into production. That benefit was about creating that rally cry across the organization, making sure everybody believes in the new mission and so forth, right? The people aspect. But it's fascinating how you say that. The more the value, you're also saying, take narrow problems that you can solve, scale it out, deliver value, deliver outcomes, and then stack it up to see how can you reimagine a particular process. Right?
I like what you said about I love what you said about the iterative approach as well, Ganesh, because I think, what is it called? The machine learning paradox, like it's a big phrase now in the industry, but it's this fundamental issue, right? Yep. Which is, for machine learning to be really put to use in real life, mission critical, lights off operations, it has to perform to a certain threshold of acceptable performance. Like the accuracy needs to be at a specific level. And so that's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is for AI to get better, for machine learning to get better, it actually needs to be put to use so it can learn from itself, right? And so you got this paradox, which is you sort of have to put machine learning in place to be able to get to higher accuracy levels. And then you need high accuracy levels to be able to actually use machine learning in a real life environment. And so, this notion of actually breaking it down and putting it in the context of business processes or other elements in kind of these microservices. And then actually the other element of that is actually putting the human in the loop, right? So you actually have to have this notion of bilinguality. I don't know if I mentioned this to you. I've always had the belief that the world doesn't really need any more machine learning scientists. Of course we do, by the way, but just bear with me.
Sure.
I think what the world needs is someone who understands finance and machine learning, someone who understands manufacturing and computer vision. It's that intersection of disciplines. It's the ability to place AI in the context of a business nuance that's really become very important. And we call it bilinguality or trilinguality, but the ability to do that is actually key and critical. And so I think the other element of putting AI to use, one is actually don't only think about this as a big app. Think about this as small microservices that you can put into every day. And by the way, we've done this in personal life. So you know what I mean, right? Like Siri and this and that, that we use it all the day. So it's the same idea. And then you have to really marry a very thoughtful human in the loop approach to that to be able to make it real. So I think that's a second kind of thing I'd point out. Maybe the third learning I have on that journey of iterative AI evolution is something that most companies I've worked with don't get to till the end, but it's like step number one, right? Which is when you think about an engineered application of artificial intelligence, in the end, when it's all said and done, the AI piece is actually 5% of the work. It's maybe 7%, maybe 10%. We really got it right. 90% of the work is, Ganesh, is actually all of the infrastructure around it, right? Getting the data in place and normalizing and sifting and curing and making sure that that's ready, and then running all the models, and then all of the version controls and knowing when to promote a new model and what accuracy levels to put it into play, or to be able to go back reflectively and look back in the past and for audit or other regulatory reasons and say, what was the data that drove what model at what point in time and what decisions were made. Like all of that infrastructure is 90+% of the work. And so, the other thing we've learned over the years is when you go down into an AI project, think about AI as the AI piece is a piece of the larger piece, and plan appropriately, build appropriately, put that infrastructure in place. So you actually end up having a production instance, not a POC example, right? And that's learning that many of us have gone through and gotten the hard way, but it's really meaningful.
No, fascinating. I think, in fact, like the couple of things, one is the fact that yes, it's iterative. You have to do it, and then the need for actually thinking about it. And I'm connecting it back to your earlier comment on outcomes, right? Just focusing on making sure that you're solving the right problems, asking the right questions. I think one of the things that, and I'm sure you agree to it, we've seen is AI requires a longer term commitment to get right, right? Partially because of the iterative nature, partially because, people have realized that you can't just buy AI because you have to weave it into your fabric. You need that, bilingual, trilingual kind of, subject matter expertise, domain expertise, plus the technology expertise. So you have to invest in building capabilities within organizations and stuff. Although I would say, like, one of my pet peeves, if you will, is when I see all of the COE work that is happening. Let's go set up a centralized COE. Let's hire people from outside and build it in, and they become the ivory tower of doing AI. You're kind of losing that, intelligence that is residual in human beings on the edges, right? So, and the hybrid approach of actually bringing that human intelligence and also bringing, deep technical expertise is the golden thing. And like you said, it's like 5% of the work is building the model, right? The rest, 95%, is actually all about the data, interpreting the data, organizing the data, making sure that you can deploy it in production, the whole nine yards. So,
Great,
no, it's fascinating. Yeah.
I was just going to say on that last point that you were making is interesting. I was recently in a conversation with the head of a recruiting firm, a large global recruiting firm, and I work with a lot of CIOs for large corporations, and so you'll often get the question of, what defines a really good CIO, and it's a really, I've spent some time thinking about this, and in all my travels and interactions with super smart people like you, and one of the things that I think has stood out for me is this mix that we need of someone who is inside out and yet outside in. And, particularly a large corporate environment, being outside in is super important because, you don't want to be confined by the four walls of the organization and therefore get caught up in the momentum
Yeah.
of here's how we used to do. Why would we even think about changing it? And you need to be close enough to emerging technologies. I know you are, by the way. You need to be in the venture ecosystem. You need to be spotting new trends, etc. So a lot of outside in thinking is actually instrumental, and it's a key part of the requirement of being effective CTO, CIO, CDO. The lead transformation agent in a company. And if you didn't have that, you couldn't get it done. But the other aspect of it is actually transformation is very fundamental. I mean, the kinds of things we're driving collectively now is actually grassroots. It encompasses the whole
Yeah.
company. It involves pretty much everyone there. And so you need the internal sort of understanding of the business model and the nuances of the processes, and then actually, to be honest, the people and the credibility and the championship, because you have to get everyone on the same page. And so in many ways,
Yeah.
unfortunately, you have to be an insider, because if you're not an insider, you can't really instrument all of those things. And so I think one of the biggest things, I sort of think about is how do you balance this outside in with an inside out perspective, and then be able to put that into play in the right way. And I just think that's like the defining characteristic now of,
That's it.
of leaders I see that are very successful in driving transformation in the industry today.
That's amazing. The unicorn transformer, if you will, right? Like who brings in the outside in perspective, remains close to that thing, and then the also understands the internal mechanics to go drive that change and drive change management at scale. In fact, I think the two things that come to mind when you were talking about this. One is the fact that machine learning is just like as close as it can get to a scientific method. Yet you start with a hypothesis, you collect data, you learn from it, and then you iterate to get to perfection, right? Or closer to perfection, right? So it's an interesting thing. Like, we were talking about iterative nature of ML. So it's very close to scientific method or how you should live life. On the other hand, what is also, maybe it's probably a random thought, but you talked about how do you drive and influence change, especially with driving transformation, changing business. For worse, good or for worse, there is a huge lesson that we can learn from social networks, because it's all about activating networks. It's about building communities. It's about driving change where you get grassroots participation to doing things, right? So one of the things I wish more organizational leaders do when they're driving transformation and change is to learn from how do we go and learn from how did Facebook go from one campus to 3.5 billion, 4.5 billion people using that platform today, right? What can we learn from driving change in that fashion? So fascinating. Thanks for sharing that. What makes a unicorn CIO? I love that. I love that section. Um, very good. So one other hot topic in AI and in across the industry is this notion of ethics and responsible AI, right? Unintended consequences, intended bad consequences, bias, the whole nine yards, right? What are you seeing in the market? Are they still theoretical discussions and conversations? Are the real impact that we're seeing? Are organizations really doing something about
I think the short answer is that I think this is recognized to be a large issue, and everyone is working on it. But collectively, we haven't done as much. I mean, that's the short version of it, right? Look, we're opening up an entirely new sort of surface area here that we're talking about in terms of, as you said, unintended consequences, bias in the way we build this AI and ML, and those are unintentional biases that we might have in there. The AI itself is interesting. With AI, it comes on the back of a lot of data, and the data has significant kind of issues associated with privacy
it?
and security, and so those are considerations to work through. Let alone sovereignty and other issues that are kind of emerging that we have to manage. And then I think even if you step away from the technology of it, I think if you broaden that out, I think there's bigger things, right? What is the place of AI in a workforce, and where is the balance between human and AI in this case, and how do we actually think through on what is going to happen inevitably, by the way, because the business benefits we're going to accrue on the back of this is just so compelling that we will move for all the right reasons into that world more and more.
Yep.
But to recognize that and proactively plan for that in terms of skilling and resourcing and people and training and all the sorts of things, so we bring our community with us in the long run, right? That's not like the tomorrow morning worry. Tomorrow morning worry is security and privacy, and then how do we make sure that we don't have unintended use and those sorts of things. But really, I think long term, I think we need to think about essentially where the puck is moving and how do we orient our communities to be able to take advantage of it. And I think those are more longer term things to think through. And so, look, I said this a few years ago, and I think at the time people were laughing at it. Now it's become very close to reality, which is I actually think boards will evolve. And, just like boards now have audit subcommittees or, or compensation committees, I think very much in the same way, there's going to be a digital ethics committee. And some companies are much closer to that than others, but that is going to become the reality of the new world. And so this is a topic to be taken seriously. It is not something you can layer on at the end. As you and I both know, you can't go build something and say, okay, now that we got that done, well, let's just layer on some responsible ethics on top of it. It can't be done that way, right? So you have to start from the scratch, from scratch, and you have to build it in. And so having a framework in place, getting the governance in place, getting it a seat on the board table, getting a digital ethics officer in place, these are all key and important steps. And so I think we have a lot more work to do. Having said that, by the way, I don't feel bad about where we are. I mean, we have progressed a lot in the last few years.
True.
And so that actually gives me a lot of encouragement and a lot of promise for the world to come.
No, it's actually true. And to your point on board engagement, I think S and the G of ESG, now ESG is a big topic on boards, right? It should include that, right? And otherwise you're not really catching that part of the surface area in driving that for your business. And so fascinating. So these are a little bit more longer term problems and stuff, right? Tell me more about what you're seeing. What are some of the still critical problems that are problems today with AI that what's your call for innovators to go solve, right?
Yeah. So, look, I sit in a world that has just an amazing amount of dark data that is sitting in voicemail or emails or PowerPoints or PDF files.
Yes.
This is years and years, decades of business intelligence that is captured, right? That email that I sent to my insurance agent, 10 years ago saying, hey, I can't make the Friday meeting because it's my son's 5th birthday. Fast forward that same email 11 years later, can lead to a simple email from the insurance company saying, Sanjay, I know your older son's turning 16. Here's a list of, best driving schools that we know in your area. And what a transformation that means for that business, which for me was this reactive, I'll call you when I need you. Meanwhile, don't bug me because I don't really need anything else, to I'm looking forward to get those moments of influence at the right point where they can impact, and inform me in decisions I need to make. And so they're the sorts of opportunities that exist. And so the game is all about not necessarily, I think there's a lot of development and R&D that needs to come in AI, but it's the application of AI in a real business context, understanding the business nuance, understanding what data exists, understanding where it sits, be able to sift through that and harmonize it and extract it, ingest it, and then be able to run AI and other algorithms. But the idea is to get to productive insights that actually inform action and get you to the end results, right? So I'll give you a few examples. I mean, the best example is, of all things that we do, we actually support a racing team, an electric racing team, the Formula E, one of the Formula E teams. And what's amazing of the work we do there is, we sit down and sort of say, well, how do we apply AI here? And I'll tell you what we did last year. I mean, this is like a fourth or fifth evolution of projects we've done. And this is super interesting because it turns out when you race on a racing circuit, the 12 teams that are racing are the drivers actually talking to the engineers on their headphones,
Sure,
and getting inputs and instructions and sharing ideas and this, that, and the other. And so you can imagine, and all those 12 channels are on the same radio frequency, so everyone can hear everyone else. And it's just this cacophony of stuff going on. A lot of it is just casual stuff. Some of it is really important stuff. And the ability to listen and actually tune into that, super important, right? Like you can get real good cues that allow you to take a turn when you need to, or overtake someone, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure.
And so we started with that and said, geez, what can we do with it? And the team went in and said, okay, well, there's a lot of data that's quote unquote locked up. It's dark. We can't extract it, and B, if we extracted it, by the time we do something, it's almost too late. Like the guy's already taken the turn, like you're too far behind, right?
Yeah.
And so we put something together, or the team put something together, and there's just incredible work. But it's the idea of actually converting all of that voice to text and then extracting from text the things that are relevant versus irrelevant, the needle in the haystack problem. And then when they're relevant, being able to convert that into a recommendation and then do all of that dynamically in real time. I mean, this is a car race, right? So these things are moving fast. And so those are very interesting applications, but it's all about lighting up dark data and being able to utilize that and convert them into insights, into things that earn productive value. So I kind of just say that. And look, I get asked this by many corporations that are embarking on the journey. And the big question is, what are 3 words of advice, right? And I say this with humility because, we've learned this through the hard way, right? You fall a few times learning how to cycle, and then you learn cycling and you do it better than anyone else. And it's because you've fallen more than anyone else, not because you were naturally good at it. And so, I think this whole notion first of POC versus production, and having a mindset to production as opposed to, I think you were saying earlier, experimentation or this incubator. Let's just get this incubator together and we'll experiment with a bunch of stuff. I think it's great to get, a lot of eyes on it and a lot of championship and belief in the power. But when you go from that to actual production, I mean, it goes back to the idea that 5%, 10% of the work is AI, 95% of the work is actually structuring and engineering the application that allows you to do that in a meaningfully stable and scalable way. And so start with that, start with a production endpoint in mind as opposed to a test and experiment and POC. So I think that's a big one. I also think the other one that's super important, particularly in the context of business actually everywhere, but business in particular, is explainability and adoption, right? And it's one, and one drives the other, right? So you have to be able to explain how you came to an answer. And it doesn't have to be, first of all, you can't be like, hey, trust me, it's a black box, but we'll get it right. No, I'm not going to trust you. I need to know exactly why. But on the other hand, it doesn't have to be this intricate amount of math that you have to display. So if you could just breadcrumb it, I'll give you an example, right? We do a lot of what we call financial spreading, which is the idea of looking at a bank's loan portfolio. And, so you got a portfolio of 5,000 companies that the bank would have lent to, and you're trying to figure out the risk on that portfolio. And the way you do that, you go through every balance sheet in that portfolio, you analyze that, apply scores, and you can aggregate the score up, and you can understand the math behind it. But what we do is we actually use AI to actually extract all the information from a balance sheet and then do all of this conversion. And so, but the idea is that when you give you a risk number, Ganesh, you can kind of go, Sanjay, I don't know if I agree with that number, and I'd go, Ganesh, click on it. And you click on it, and it breaks it down by here are the top 10 companies in that portfolio that drove this specific thing. It's like, well, this one doesn't look right. And we'll click on it. And then you break it down and then you click again, and it's like, okay, that number, I really don't buy, Sanjay. And it's kind of like, okay, look at that. And it's like, here are the 2 sentences on the footnote on page 19 of this balance sheet that, gave us that indication, right? And if you look back and say, what would I have done in the real world? Well, I'd walk down to the CPA or the individual that was doing the work, and I'd go over to them, knock them on their shoulder and say, Sanjay, what's going on? And what would Sanjay do? He'd pull up the balance sheet and show you those 2 sentences, right? So it's the same thing. You have to breadcrumb it down to that level so people can kind of get that. And that, I think, drives a lot of adoption. And so I always, when you put AI into an enterprise environment, you have to have explainability built in. And then my third thing, and we covered this earlier, is just governance, right? It's, you design it in, right? Don't add it on at the later. Design it in at day one and think through the different aspects of governance and put up a framework and get the components in place and spend the time on it, and you'll get to the right endpoint. And know that just adding at the last minute won't get you to the right answer. And so those are sort of a few things that I think is super important as we all start or embark or maybe go deeper into our AI journeys. There's a lot of value to be had. We see so many productive, real life use cases. And it used to be, it's just productivity. It's no longer productivity. It's actually about new value. It's about competitive differentiation. It's about pricing. It's about revenue increase, right? That we wouldn't otherwise get without AI. But then you have to approach it in a very methodical fashion with all the right basics in place. So that's sort of how I think about it.
That's awesome. Just to quickly summarize for myself, the part on what problems are still unsolved, I could not agree with you more, right? Which is dark data, and you called it. I'm actually looking at not just the historic dark data, but 90% of all net new data being created is unstructured, right? And the problem with just unstructured data, one, it's sitting in all those different things and it's all going to be dark because it's not easily analyzable. But on top of that, you have to capture the context of what that data is in relation to, right? So then brings the problem of the interconnected data, if you will. So I think you rightly said, I think that's the huge opportunity for entrepreneurs all over. And then on the advice to the organizations, I love the way the very crisp 3 pointers, right? One is start with a production mindset. So that aligns a lot of things, what you do from POC to getting in there. Capability building, talent, thinking about it as an engineering system, that kind of stuff, right? Explainability and adoption. I could, it's amazing that you brought that up. And people think of explainability as a technical only term that you have to actually get understand the area under the curve kind of thing. But the more important thing is, how do you help users, business users who have the context, interrogate the data or the recommendations so they gain more trust in that, right? So it's amazing. And then governance, actually making sure that you have the right guardrails and the and kill switches for unintended consequences. I think it's beautiful, brilliant advice for that. Sanjay, this has been a blast. How can the viewers and listeners get in touch with you? Where can they find you on the internet? And if I remember right, you also have a weekly show that you actually do quick conversations with business leaders, right? Where can they find you on the internet?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn, and I manage my LinkedIn myself, and I run it through it every day. So that's probably the easiest way for people to get a hold of me. And then I'm obviously at Genpact as well. So, and I welcome all interactions. So I look forward to that.
Awesome. Sanjay, thank you so much. Thanks for taking the time today. This was a blast. And I can't wait to actually collaborate with you more.
Oh, you've been very generous. Thank you for taking the time. I loved our conversations. Always love talking to you. Good luck with what you do, and we'll catch up separately.
Thank you, Sanjay.